Why did nobody ever look her in the eye? That thought crossed Sarah Miller's mind more times than she cared to admit. Every morning she woke to the same desert sun, blistering and bright, beating down on a sea of khaki tents and restless dust. Every morning, she walked the same path to the supply tent, head lowered, clipboard in hand, blending into the background of a base that never seemed to notice her. The others passed by in a rush of laughter, orders, and footsteps. Soldiers, medics, officers, all busy with their own missions. To them, she was just the quiet girl in the field tent who managed boxes and checklists. Invisible, reliable, forgettable. No one asked her name. No one asked why her hands, though calloused, moved with a calm precision that didn't belong to logistics. But she didn't complain, not once. Sarah Miller had learned long ago that speaking up didn't always bring change. Sometimes it only brought silence. The desert air shimmered with heat as she bent to lift another crate. Sweat traced the side of her neck, collecting in the fabric of her uniform. Inside the tent, the air was heavy, a mix of canvas, dust, and antiseptic. She stacked the boxes neatly, labeled them, double-checked the manifest. Organization was her shield. Control, her way of staying sane. What no one knew was that behind that quiet rhythm lived a woman with 5 years of medical experience. A certified emergency medical technician who had seen more trauma than most soldiers ever would. Back home, she'd worked in city hospitals where the nights were long and the sirens never stopped. She'd been the one kneeling on cold tiles, stabilizing victims, keeping hearts beating long enough for doctors to arrive. And through it all, she'd learned one truth: staying calm saves lives. So when she joined the military, she thought she'd finally found her purpose on a larger scale, saving lives under fire, healing those who gave everything. But fate, or maybe bureaucracy, had other plans. A single clerical mistake, a line misplaced in the system. Instead of being assigned to the medical corps, her file was buried somewhere under supply management. By the time anyone noticed, the slots were full, the rotations were locked, and the military machine had moved on without her. At first she fought it. She filled forms, she asked officers, she waited in lines. But every conversation ended the same way: "We'll look into it, Specialist Miller." Weeks turned into months, then months into silence. Now, a year later, she was still here in the background, tending to boxes of medical gear she wasn't allowed to touch. Still, she stayed. Not because she'd given up, but because she couldn't walk away from the people who might need her someday. Somewhere deep inside, Sarah believed the day would come when all this waiting would make sense. That day wasn't today. The bass around her buzzed with its usual rhythm, the thrum of generators, the grind of engines, the murmurs of soldiers tired from drills. Beyond the tents, the desert stretched endlessly, a horizon of gold and silence. As she finished counting the last crate, a sound cut through the monotony, the sharp bark of orders near the medical tent. She froze, listening. Through the open flap, she saw movement, medics rushing in and out, faces tight, voices clipped. Something was wrong. She stepped closer, not enough to intrude, but close enough to hear snatches of conversation. "Two medics down, transferred out last week. Short-staffed again. We can't keep up." Sarah's chest tightened. She knew those words. The same words she'd heard 100 times in hospital corridors when the night shift was stretched too thin. She could help them, she knew she could. But she also knew the rule book, the one that had kept her caged for a year. Stay in your lane, follow your assignment, chain of command first. Protocol over instinct, paper over purpose. So she turned away, forcing herself back toward the supply tent. As the day faded, the desert softened. Orange bled into rose, and the sun melted into the horizon like a tired flame. Sarah sat outside her tent, watching the light die behind the dunes. The quiet was her only friend out here. She pulled a small notebook from her pocket, her ritual at the end of every day. Its pages were worn, its corners creased, its ink filled with everything she couldn't say aloud. She wrote about the work, the crates, the sand, the monotony, but between the lines she wrote about the ache, the feeling of being trapped in the wrong uniform, in the wrong tent, in the wrong story. Still, there was hope in her handwriting, a fragile belief that someday someone would see her for who she was. That night, as the desert cooled and the stars stretched wide, she closed her notebook and looked up. The sky felt impossibly vast, like it was waiting. And somewhere in that vastness, she felt it, the quiet pull of fate inching closer. She didn't know when it would arrive or what it would demand of her, only that it would. She lay back on her cot, staring at the canvas ceiling, her mind whispering the same silent promise she wrote every night. When the time comes, don't hesitate. The next morning began like any other. She woke before dawn, dressed in silence, and made her way to the supply tent. The air was cool, almost kind, the only gentle hour before the desert turned merciless again. Sarah unlocked the tent, inhaled the familiar scent of canvas and dust, and began her checklist. Nothing ever changed here. Until it did. Shouting broke through the hum of the bass, sharp, urgent, not the usual kind. This was panic. Sarah's head snapped toward the sound. Soldiers were running, their boots pounding the dirt toward the medical tent. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. She took one step forward, then stopped. Orders echoed in her memory. Stay in the supply area. Do not interfere unless requested. Her fists clenched. Another shout, then another. She saw Corporal Jensen, one of the medics, rushing out of the tent. His face was pale, his movements frantic. "Anyone with medical training," he yelled. "We need help." Sarah froze. For a moment everything inside her collided: duty, fear, rules, instinct. And then she saw it, a young soldier sprinting toward her, his expression terrified. Private Rodriguez. "Sarah, there's been an accident," he gasped. "Training vehicle flipped, multiple injuries, medics can't handle it alone." Something inside her snapped. The line she'd drawn for a year vanished in a heartbeat. "Take me there," she said, voice firm. Rodriguez blinked, uncertain. "But now." He didn't argue. He turned and ran, and she followed. The sand kicked up beneath their boots, the air thick with dust and dread. As they neared the medical tent, the noise hit her, the chaos, the cries, the rush of orders shouted over confusion. Inside it was worse. 3 soldiers lay on cots, their uniforms torn, their bodies bloodied. One was barely conscious, his leg wrapped in a blood-soaked bandage. Another clutched his arm at an angle no limb should bend. The third wasn't moving at all. Sarah's breath hitched, not in fear but in focus. Everything slowed. Every sound faded until there was only the rhythm of her pulse and the clarity of training. "Gauze," she ordered, snapping on gloves before anyone could question her presence. "Tourniquet now." Jensen looked up, startled, then recognized the authority in her tone. He threw her the supplies without a word. Sarah pressed her hands to the bleeding wound, firm and steady. "Stay with me," she told the soldier, her voice calm. "You're going to be okay. Breathe, that's it." She wrapped, tightened, assessed. No arterial spray, good. The bleeding slowed. "Next." The soldier with the broken arm was moaning, shaking. She moved to him, examined the limb gently. "Fracture, midshaft humerus. No open wound." She called for a splint. Her hands worked with instinctual precision, her voice low and reassuring. "You did good, just hold still. I've got you." Then the third soldier, unconscious, shallow breathing, cyanotic lips. "Airway obstruction," she murmured. She tilted his head back, cleared his mouth, checked his pulse. Weak but present. She ordered oxygen prep, repositioned his airway, and stabilized his head. One breath, then another. And slowly, his chest began to rise evenly. Around her, the chaos softened. The tent filled with a strange quiet, the kind that comes when fear meets competence. An hour later, it was over. The bleeding was stopped, the fractures stabilized, the unconscious soldier breathing on his own. Sarah stepped back, sweat streaking her temples, her hands trembling as the adrenaline drained. Jensen approached her, eyes wide. "Where the hell did you learn to do all that?" Sarah took a slow breath. "I used to be an EMT," she said softly. "Before all this, my transfer, it never went through." He stared at her, disbelief giving way to awe. "You just saved their lives." Sarah glanced at the cots, at the soldiers now stable, alive. Relief flooded her chest. "I just did what I was trained to do." But inside, something shifted. For the first time in over a year, she felt seen. As word spread across the camp, whispers followed. "The supply girl." No way she was in there, leading the medics. "General's gonna hear about this." By dusk, everyone knew. And Sarah, once invisible, found herself standing under the fatting desert sun, caught between fear and pride. She had broken protocol. She had crossed the line. But as she looked at the distant tents glowing in the last light, she knew one thing for certain. If she had to choose again, she'd do it every time. Because sometimes the right thing doesn't wait for permission. And in that moment, she didn't just save lives. She saved herself from silence, from invisibility, from being forgotten. The girl in the field tent had finally stepped into the light. What happens when doing the right thing breaks the rules? That question haunted Sarah the entire night. The camp had gone quiet after the chaos, but inside her tent, the silence felt heavier than ever. She sat on her cot, her hands still trembling faintly from the adrenaline. The scent of antiseptic clung to her sleeves, and when she closed her eyes, she could still see flashes of what had happened: the blood, the broken limbs, the pale face of the unconscious soldier as his breathing steadied. She had saved them, there was no doubt, but now came the harder part, the waiting. Protocol didn't care about intention, it cared about order. Sarah knew she'd crossed a line. She had stepped outside her assignment without clearance, taken charge of a situation she wasn't authorized to be in. In the military, that wasn't initiative, it was insubordination. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. She turned her notebook open in her lap, pen hovering over the page. Tonight's entry came slowly. Her handwriting was tight, deliberate. They were alive. That's what matters. If I'm punished for that, then so be it. She closed the notebook softly, set it beside her, and lay back, staring up at the faint shadow of the tent ceiling. Outside, the generators hummed. The wind brushed the canvas walls like distant waves. She whispered to herself, "If saving someone is wrong, maybe I don't want to be right." The next morning arrived like a verdict. The sun hadn't fully risen when she heard footsteps outside. A shadow appeared at the entrance of her tent. "Specialist Miller," a voice called, firm, familiar. She recognized it instantly: Lieutenant Carter. The same officer who'd asked her, months ago, if she was settling in fine, the same one she'd lied to, saying she was. She stood quickly, straightening her uniform, heartbeat thudding in her chest. "Sir." He stepped in, expression unreadable. "Walk with me." They crossed the compound in silence. The air was sharp with the smell of sand and diesel. Soldiers saluted as Carter passed, their eyes flicking briefly to Sarah, whispers following in their wake. Everyone had heard. At the edge of the camp, Carter stopped. He turned toward her, eyes narrowing just slightly. "Tell me what happened." Sarah kept her voice steady. "There was an emergency. The medics were overwhelmed. I assisted." "Assisted," he repeated quietly, almost to himself. "From what I've heard, you led the entire response." She hesitated. "I did what was necessary, sir. Lives were at risk." He studied her for a long moment. No anger, just calculation. "You know the rules." "Yes, sir." "And you broke them." "Yes, sir." A pause, then unexpectedly he nodded once. "Good." Sarah blinked. "Sir." Carter sighed, looking toward the horizon. I've been in this uniform long enough to know that sometimes the rules lag behind reality. You saved 3 soldiers, Miller. But understand, not everyone will see it that way. The warning hit harder than any reprimand could. He looked back at her. You'll be called to the command tent. There'll be an inquiry. Tell the truth. Don't embellish, don't downplay, just the truth. She swallowed. Yes, sir. Carter gave a small nod. Whatever happens next, you did the right thing. Remember that. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing alone under the desert sun, the wind lifting dust around her boots. The next 2 days crawled by like years. She kept to her tent mostly, going through the motions of her supply work, but the rhythm was broken. Everywhere she went, soldiers stared, not with disdain but with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Respect. Some nodded silently when she passed. Others offered quiet thanks. One afternoon, Corporal Jensen appeared outside her tent, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed her one, his grin tired but genuine. They're all stable, he said. The leg wound, the fracture, the concussion, they'll recover. Sarah felt a weight lift off her chest she hadn't realized was still there. All of them. All of them, Jensen confirmed. He took a sip, then added softly, You saved their lives. Don't let anyone tell you different. She smiled faintly, looking down into her cup. The desert wind carried a thin line of dust between them. He hesitated, then said, There's going to be an investigation. Officers want to know how a supply specialist ended up running triage. I know, she said quietly. Just be honest. She nodded, grateful for the advice. As he turned to leave, he added, Whatever they decide, Miller, we all saw what you did. That matters. When he walked away, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt since joining the service, belonging. The 3rd morning came with a call to report to the command tent. She stood outside for a moment before entering, trying to slow her breathing. The desert heat was already climbing, the light harsh and unforgiving. Inside, 3 officers sat behind a long table, Major Stevens, the base medical officer, Captain Reynolds, who oversaw personnel, and Lieutenant Carter, now seated off to the side. The air was cool, quiet, sterile. Major Stevens looked up. Specialist Miller, sit down. She obeyed, back straight, eyes forward. For a long moment no one spoke. The silence pressed down like weight. Then Stevens began. We've reviewed reports from the incident. We want to hear it from you directly. Sarah clasped her hands together, forcing her voice not to shake. She told them everything. How she'd heard the shouting, how Corporal Jensen called for help, how she'd stepped in when no one else responded. She described the injuries, the treatments, the triage order she'd made instinctively. Her words were clinical, precise, the way she'd been trained, but beneath them was the quiet tremor of emotion she couldn't hide. When she finished, she sat still, waiting. Major Stevens glanced at his notes. You were trained as an EMT before enlistment. Yes, sir. 5 years experience in civilian trauma care. Why weren't you assigned to medical? There was a clerical error during processing, she said carefully. I submitted requests for reassignment, but they were never approved. Captain Reynolds frowned slightly. And you didn't escalate further. I did at first, sir. Then I stopped. After months of waiting, I assumed the system would correct itself. Her honesty hung in the air, equal parts courage and regret. Lieutenant Carter leaned forward, his tone softer. And when you entered that tent, you knew you were breaking protocol. Sarah met his gaze. Yes, sir, but I also knew if I didn't, people might die. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Major Stevens sat back, his eyes thoughtful. Thank you, specialist, that will be all. She rose, saluted, and left the tent. Outside, the sunlight hit her face, blindingly bright. She exhaled shakily, her chest tight with exhaustion. The inquiry was over, but the outcome was still a coin in the air. That evening, the desert painted itself in violet and gold. Sarah sat by herself again, notebook open on her knees. The ink shimmered faintly in the fading light. I told them everything, she wrote. No excuses, no defenses, just the truth. Whatever happens next, I can live with that. She looked up at the horizon. For a moment, she felt strangely calm. If this was the end of her time here, at least she'd left it better than she found it. But somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered, maybe it's not the end. Maybe it's just the beginning. The following morning, she was summoned again. This time, only Major Stevens waited inside the command tent. He gestured for her to sit. "Specialist Miller," he began, tone steady, "we've reached a decision." Her pulse spiked, but she kept her expression neutral. He looked at her for a long moment before continuing. "Your actions during the emergency were extraordinary. You demonstrated skill, composure, and leadership under pressure. You saved lives." He paused, and Sarah braced for the inevitable, however. "But," he continued, "you did act outside your assigned duties. Normally, that would require disciplinary review." She nodded once. "Understood, sir." Stevens folded his hands on the table. "Given the circumstances and the outcome, we've decided not to pursue disciplinary action." Sarah's breath caught. "Instead," he went on, "we've corrected the administrative error. Effective immediately, you're reassigned to the medical unit. You'll report here tomorrow morning. You'll serve under my supervision." For a moment she couldn't speak. The words hit harder than she expected. After everything, the months of invisibility, the frustration, the waiting, she was finally where she was meant to be. "Thank you, sir," she managed, voice trembling slightly. Stevens nodded, a hint of a smile softening his usually stern face. "You earned this. Don't waste it." She stood, saluted. As she stepped out of the tent, sunlight washed over her, warm, almost forgiving. The air felt different, lighter. She was a medic now. No more waiting. No more hiding behind supply lists and inventory sheets. That night she packed her things, a few clothes, a handful of keepsakes, and the small stack of medical textbooks she'd kept since her hospital days. She paused on the last page of her notebook before closing it. Tomorrow, everything changes. The next day dawned clean and still, the kind of morning that feels like a blank page. Sarah woke before the sun, her uniform pressed, her boots clean, her nerves coiled tight. As she crossed the base, soldiers nodded to her with quiet recognition. The same people who'd never noticed her before now knew exactly who she was. Inside the medical tent, Corporal Jensen greeted her with a grin. "Welcome home, Medic Miller." For the first time in a long time, she smiled back without hesitation. He gave her a quick tour: equipment shelves, sterilization areas, medication logs. Everything she'd been organizing from a distance was now within reach. She ran her fingers over a tray of instruments, her reflection faint in the polished metal. "This is where I belong," she whispered under her breath. Outside, the base was stirring. Soldiers were preparing for inspection. Rumor had it a high-ranking officer, a general, was visiting. Sarah barely noticed. She was too focused on her work. She checked vitals, treated minor injuries, logged reports. The hours passed easily, like muscle memory rediscovered. For the first time since she enlisted, her day didn't feel wasted. And yet, there was still that quiet pull in the back of her mind, the sense that something larger was still unfolding. Something that would soon draw every eye on base, toward the quiet girl no one had noticed before. But for now, she let herself breathe. She'd waited a year for this, and in the still hum of the medical tent, surrounded by the sound of heart monitors and quiet gratitude, she finally felt it. Peace. Why do the quiet ones always get noticed last? That thought crossed Sarah's mind as she leaned over a patient's cot, checking his pulse. The medical tent was filled with the faint hum of equipment and the low murmur of voices, organized, steady, alive. 3 weeks ago, she had been invisible, just a shadow moving between crates. Now, her hands moved with practiced certainty. The same precision that had once been confined to inventory logs now guided IV lines and gauze pads. The soldiers trusted her now. When they came into the tent with a fever, a twisted ankle, or a deep worry they couldn't name, they asked for Medic Miller. It still felt strange to hear it, that title. It didn't just sound like a rank, it sounded like belonging. But today wasn't just another day. The entire base was different, sharper, cleaner, tighter. The energy in the air was unmistakable. A general was coming. And not just any general. General Hawkins, regional commander, known for his no-nonsense leadership and piercing eye for detail. When Hawkins visited, everything was inspected, from the shine on boots to the order of supply chains. Nothing escaped him. Everyone was nervous. Even the officers seemed to stand straighter. Sarah didn't think the general's visit would have anything to do with her. She was new in the medical unit, barely a week into her official role. She expected to remain quietly in the background doing her job, keeping her head down. But fate had other plans. By noon, the heat was oppressive. The air shimmered above the sand like a mirage. Sarah stood by a cabinet, reorganizing supplies, when she heard it, the low thunder of approaching rotors. Helicopters. They came in fast, 2 of them, cutting across the horizon like dark wings. Dust erupted in plumes as they touched down at the far edge of the base. From a distance, she could see the command entourage, clean uniforms, precise steps, and in the center, the tall, silver-haired man himself. General Hawkins. Even from where she stood, he had presence, not just authority but gravity. The kind of man who made silence follow wherever he went. She turned back to her work, trying to ignore the tightening in her chest. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was the same sensation she'd felt during that first emergency, the sense that something was about to happen. An hour later, the door flap opened. Major Stevens walked in first, flanked by 2 officers, and behind them General Hawkins. Every medic in the room instinctively straightened. Stevens began the tour, his voice steady and professional. He explained the tent's layout, the emergency capacity, the procedures in place for rapid response. The general listened without expression, hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning every corner. When he reached Sarah's side, Stevens gestured toward her. "This is Specialist Miller, our newest medic, transferred from logistics just last week." Hawkins nodded slightly, acknowledging her presence. His gaze lingered on her for a moment, sharp, assessing before he moved on. And that would have been the end of it. Except for the voice that broke the silence. "Sir, that's her." Everyone turned. The voice came from the far side of the tent, from one of the injured soldiers resting on a cot. Private Daniels, the young man who had been unconscious during the accident. He was sitting up now, still pale, still weak, but very much alive. The general paused. "I beg your pardon, soldier." Daniels swallowed hard, his voice trembling with emotion. "That's her, sir, the one who saved us, the one from the supply tent." The room went still. Sarah froze. Hawkins turned back to her slowly. "Is that true?" Major Stevens shifted slightly, about to explain, but the general raised a hand. "I asked her." Sarah's throat felt dry. Her voice came out quiet but clear. "Yes, sir. There was an accident during a training exercise. The medics were short-handed. I stepped in to assist." The general's eyes narrowed, studying her face. "Assist?" She hesitated, not out of fear but humility. "I treated the injured, sir. 3 soldiers, 2 with fractures, 1 with a head injury." Stevens spoke up then, his tone measured. "General, Specialist Miller was previously a certified EMT. There was a clerical mistake in her assignment when she enlisted. The issue has since been corrected." Hawkins said nothing for a long moment. Then his voice came low and steady. Why didn't someone catch that earlier? Stevens shifted, embarrassed. Administrative oversight, sir. The error went unnoticed until the incident. The general's gaze returned to Sarah. And when you acted that day, you were not authorized to perform medical duties. No, sir. Then why did you? It wasn't an accusation. It was curiosity, the kind of question that tests the soul, not the report. Sarah took a slow breath. Because I could help, she said simply. Because people were hurt and I had the training to make a difference. I knew it wasn't my job, but it was my responsibility. The tent stayed silent. Even the hum of the equipment seemed to fade. Hawkins looked at her for a long, thoughtful moment. Then something in his expression shifted, not softness exactly, but understanding. Major Stevens, he said finally, turning to the officer, I want a full account of this incident, and I want to know why talent like this was left unused for a year. Yes, sir. The general's gaze lingered on Sarah one last time before he continued the inspection. But as he walked away, she saw it, the faintest trace of a smile, barely there, hidden behind the steel of his command. When the inspection ended, the general's convoy moved across the base. Soldiers stood at attention, rows perfectly aligned. The sun blazed overhead, but no one moved. After the formalities, Hawkins broke away from his entourage and returned to the medical tent, alone. Sarah looked up in surprise as he entered. He approached her quietly, his boots barely making a sound on the packed sand floor. I spoke to the soldiers you treated, he said. They're alive because of you. Thank you, sir, she said softly. He studied her, his eyes like searchlights. You understand the balance between discipline and initiative, specialist. I do now, sir. He nodded slowly. Rules matter, but sometimes the mission matters more. Then he said something that would echo through the base for weeks to come. You didn't just save 3 soldiers. You saved this unit. Your actions reminded everyone here what service actually means. Sarah felt her breath catch. She tried to speak, but no words came. The general turned to Stevens, who had just entered. I want her talents used properly, and I want her to teach others. Too many soldiers freeze when someone goes down. Let her fix that. Stevens nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Hawkins looked back at Sarah. You're going to train this base and everyone after it in emergency care. If you can give others even a fraction of what you have, you'll save more lives than you'll ever know. Then, in front of everyone, he gave her a crisp salute. The kind of salute that wasn't about rank, but respect. Sarah stood straighter, returning it, her throat tight with emotion. When the general left, the tent stayed silent for several seconds, until Jensen broke it with a quiet laugh. Guess the field tent girl just became the base's secret weapon. The others smiled, some clapped her on the shoulder. But Sarah, she just stood there stunned. It wasn't pride she felt, it wasn't victory. It was something purer. Validation. For months, she had questioned whether her presence here mattered at all. Now, the highest-ranking officer on the base had told her it did. That night, as the desert wind swept through camp and the stars glowed like cold fire, Sarah sat outside the medical tent with her notebook again. The pages fluttered in the breeze. She wrote about the day, about the look on the general's face when he said those words, about the way her heart had trembled not from fear, but from something she hadn't felt in a long time, purpose. She ended the entry with a single line. When the moment comes, do the work even if no one's watching. The following days moved quickly. Word of what had happened spread across the base like wildfire. Soldiers nodded to her as she passed, not out of pity or politeness but recognition. The tent girl who had once gone unnoticed was now being asked to brief units, coordinate emergency plans, and, at the general's request, design the first round of field medical readiness training. Major Stevens met with her daily to discuss details. Start simple, he said. We'll build from there. But Sarah already had a vision. She wanted every soldier to know the basics, how to stop bleeding, how to keep someone breathing, how to act instead of freeze. Because she'd seen what hesitation cost. She spent her evenings writing lesson plans under dim light, her notebook now filled with sketches of diagrams and steps. When Jensen saw her one night, surrounded by papers, he smiled. "You don't waste any time, do you?" Sarah shrugged. "People don't stop getting hurt just because we're tired." He laughed softly. "You know, that's exactly what the general said about you." Sarah looked up. "He talked about me." "Yeah, said initiative like yours doesn't come through often. Said your story, going to reach more people than you realize." She blinked, quiet. "I didn't do it to be noticed." "I know," he said. "That's why you were." The first training session took place a week later, a small gathering of 30 soldiers in the open desert under the rising sun. Sarah stood in front of them, her notes clutched in one hand, her voice steady but nervous. She began with the simplest question. "If someone gets hurt next to you, what's the first thing you do?" Silence. Then one soldier spoke up, uncertain. "Call for help." Sarah nodded. "Good, but what if help is 10 minutes away, 20? They looked at each other. "That's what this is for," she said softly. "So that help starts right here with you." And as she taught them how to stop a bleed, check an airway, or keep a pulse steady, she saw it in their faces: understanding, confidence. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt whole. Because she wasn't just saving lives anymore. She was teaching others to save them too. And that was the kind of legacy no paperwork could ever erase. How do you teach courage? That was the question Sarah asked herself every morning as she stood before rows of soldiers. Not medics, not professionals, but ordinary men and women who'd signed up to serve, not realizing how close war could bring them to fragility. The desert wind cut across the open training ground, lifting fine grains of sand that stung the skin and shimmered in the sun. Around her, 30 soldiers knelt in the dust, practicing tourniquet application on dummies and foam limbs. Their hands were rough, their movements clumsy, but their eyes were focused. Sarah walked between them, her tone calm, measured. "Tighter," she told one. "You're not cutting off circulation, you're controlling it." A young soldier frowned, turning the windlass another notch. "Like this, ma'am." Sarah nodded. "Better. Remember, pain means blood is still moving. It's okay to hurt if it keeps them alive." They nodded, absorbing every word. It was strange standing there, giving commands, her voice carrying across the field. She'd spent so long avoiding attention that it still felt unnatural. But now, as she watched the soldiers focus, as she saw them trying, failing, improving, she realized something beautiful. Respect didn't come from rank. It came from purpose. She didn't need stripes or stars to lead, just conviction. By the end of the session, every soldier's uniform was dusted with sweat and grit. But they stayed until the last exercise, until Sarah was sure they could repeat each motion from memory. As the group dispersed, Corporal Jensen walked up, wiping his brow. "You do realize the general wanted a short introductory course, right?" Sarah smirked faintly. "He asked for effective, not short." Jensen chuckled, shaking his head. "You've got half the base wrapped around your finger." She glanced toward the soldiers walking away, their laughter mixing with the gusting wind. "Not around my finger," she said softly. "Around an idea." Over the next week, the base changed. Not in the way a storm changes land, but slowly, subtly, like a tide rising. Where once the medical tent had been a quiet back corner of the base, it was now a center of learning. Soldiers came in groups, notebooks in hand, eager to practice skills that had once seemed too technical or irrelevant. Sarah saw it in their faces: pride, confidence, the kind that came not from carrying a weapon, but from knowing that when someone fell, they could keep them alive. Even off duty, soldiers practiced on each other, wrapping bandages, checking pulses, laughing when they got it wrong but trying again. Major Stevens watched it all from a distance, quiet satisfaction in his eyes. One evening he stopped by as Sarah was reviewing her lesson plans. "You've created something real here," he said, leaning on the tent pole. "Do you realize that?" Sarah looked up from her notes. "It's just training, sir." "No," he said firmly, "it's transformation." She smiled softly, then turned the page. "It's their hands that save lives, not mine." Stevens tilted his head, regarding her for a moment. "That humility will carry you far, specialist." He left her to her work, and she sat there in the fading light, feeling a quiet warmth spread through her chest. This was what she'd wanted when she enlisted. Not glory, not recognition, just the chance to make a difference. 2 weeks later, she got her test. It came on a day that began like any other: blistering heat, cloudless sky, routine drills echoing across the dunes. Sarah was in the medical tent, restocking gauze, when a soldier burst through the flap. His voice was breathless, panicked. "Ma'am, we need you now." Sarah froze mid-motion. What happened? "Patrol exercise 2 miles out. A soldier collapsed. Heat stroke may be worse. The medevac's still 20 minutes out." Without hesitation, she grabbed her emergency kit. "Show me." They raced across the sand in a transport jeep, the engine growling against the wind. Dust billowed in their wake as the camp shrank behind them. Sarah's heartbeat was steady, not fast, not slow, just focused. This was the moment training was made for. When they reached the patrol site, soldiers were gathered in a circle around a figure on the ground. A young man lay there unmoving, his face crimson with heat. Sweat glistened on his skin, but his body wasn't cooling, it was baking. His chest rose shallowly, unevenly. Sarah knelt beside him, eyes scanning, pulse rapid, pupils dilated, skin hot and dry, classic heat stroke. "Remove his vest and boots," she ordered sharply. "Get me towels, anything to soak." The soldiers scrambled. Within seconds she had canteens pouring over cloth, pressing them to the major arteries: neck, armpits, groin. "Lift his legs gently." They obeyed. Then, for the first time, she looked up and saw the faces around her. Recognizable. They were her trainees. The very soldiers who had sat in the dirt weeks ago, fumbling with tourniquets and stammering through first aid steps. Now they were moving without hesitation, fanning the injured man, shielding him from the sun, mixing a rehydration solution just as she'd taught. Sarah's throat tightened. "Good," she said. "Keep him talking if you can." Private Chen, one of her best students, leaned close to the collapsed man. "Hey, buddy, stay with us, all right? You're not getting out of drills that easy." The man stirred weakly, murmuring something incoherent. Sarah smiled faintly. "That's it, he's responsive." Minutes dragged by, each one thick with tension. The helicopter's distant hum was still faint, too far away. Sarah checked his pulse again, slowing, not stable yet. "Chen, alternate cold compresses, rotate them every minute. Don't let the fabric dry." "Yes, ma'am." The team worked in rhythm, trained hands doing what instinct alone never could. When the medevac finally arrived, Sarah briefed the flight medic, concise, calm, professional. "Initial collapse due to exertional heat stroke. Immediate cooling initiated, airway stable, vitals improving." The medic nodded, impressed. "You did everything right. Another 10 minutes he'd have been critical." As the helicopter lifted off, dust swirling around them, Sarah turned back toward her team. They stood there, sweat-soaked and silent, watching the chopper fade into the blazing sky. Then Private Chen spoke softly. "Ma'am, we did it." Sarah looked at him, pride swelling quietly in her chest. "Yes," she said, "you did." Back at base, the story spread fast. By nightfall, everyone knew. The patrol team had saved one of their own, not by luck, not by panic, but by training. Sarah's training. When she walked through the mess hall later, conversation hushed for a moment, then resumed in low murmurs of respect. She wasn't invisible anymore, but strangely, she missed the silence. Recognition was heavy in its own way. That night she sat outside again, notebook in her lap, the desert wind cool against her face. She wrote. They remembered, they acted, that's all I ever wanted. She paused, staring at the ink, then added softly beneath it. Maybe teaching courage isn't about making people fearless. Maybe it's about reminding them what matters when fear arrives. She closed the notebook gently, her heart full and aching all at once. A few days later, Major Stevens called her into his office. He stood at his desk, hands clasped, a faint smile on his face. I heard about the patrol incident, he said. The report says the soldier's stable, thanks to immediate field care. Your program worked. Sarah nodded modestly. They did all the work, sir. I just showed them how. Stevens leaned back, studying her. You've done more than that. You've built a foundation we can expand. Expand. He nodded. Other bases are already asking for your curriculum, word spreading fast. Sarah blinked, surprised. You mean they want me to train others, he said. Exactly. What you've started here is bigger than this base. It's going regional. For a moment, Sarah couldn't find her voice. She spent a year trying to be useful, and now, suddenly, the entire system wanted her. I don't know what to say, sir. Stevens smiled faintly. Say yes, and keep doing what you do best. Over the following month, her days blurred into motion. She spent mornings in the medical tent, afternoons conducting training, evenings drafting manuals and field guides. She stopped counting hours. Purpose made time irrelevant. And though exhaustion clung to her bones, she wouldn't have traded it for anything. Everywhere she went, soldiers greeted her with nods or smiles. She was no longer the girl from the supply tent. She was Medic Miller, the woman whose quiet defiance had changed the way they saw themselves. Her course became mandatory for all new deployments in the region. The general himself sent commendations through channels, acknowledging her initiative. But Sarah didn't chase medals. She chased meaning. And every time she watched another soldier kneel over a practice dummy with confidence, she felt that meaning echo through her, steady, grounded, real. Late one night, after finishing another training plan, she sat alone under the stars again. The desert stretched out in silence, vast and endless. She remembered her first nights here, the loneliness, the invisibility, the feeling that her skills were wasted. Now everything was different. But she hadn't changed because the system noticed her. She had changed because she stopped waiting for permission to do what was right. The desert wind brushed her face, whispering against the canvas tents like distant applause. She smiled faintly and whispered to the dark. It was never about being seen. It was about seeing where I was needed. Then she closed her notebook and looked up at the stars, her reflection in their cold light steady and unshaken. Tomorrow there would be more work, more lives to prepare, more lessons to teach. And for the first time, she felt she was exactly where she was meant to be, not standing out, not standing apart, but standing ready. Because when the call came again, she would answer it the same way she always had. Quietly, confidently, completely. What happens when something small becomes larger than you ever imagined? Sarah Miller never asked for attention. She never wanted the spotlight or her name etched into reports or the weight of a program carrying her initials. All she'd ever wanted was to be useful, to help where others couldn't. But life, it seemed, had a way of taking quiet intent and turning it into something unstoppable. By the second month of her field medical training program, the base looked different. Not physically, the tents, the dust, the endless sky all stayed the same, but in spirit. Every soldier now knew how to check a pulse, stop a bleed, and recognize the warning signs of shock or heat stroke. They spoke about response drills, with the same seriousness they once reserved for weapons checks. And when someone got hurt, even slightly, there was no hesitation. They acted. Sarah saw it everywhere, that shift. And every time, it filled her chest with something she hadn't felt since she first joined the service: purpose. She was no longer invisible, but she still walked the base with the same quiet humility as before. The only difference was, this time, people stepped aside for her. One afternoon, as the desert sun burned high, Major Stevens walked into the medical tent holding a folder. He didn't knock, he never did anymore. "Busy?" he asked, though his tone already knew the answer. Sarah looked up from her notes, smiling faintly. "Always." He placed the folder on the table in front of her. "Then I'll make it quick. You've got an invitation." She frowned. "From who?" He nodded toward the folder. "Regional Command. They're holding a leadership meeting next week. They want you to present your training program." Her hand paused halfway through turning a page. "Present?" "Yes," Stevens said, leaning back. "You've been mentioned in 3 separate command reports. The general's words carry weight. Other bases want to learn what you've built here, and the brass wants to see the person behind it." Sarah stared at the folder, unsure whether to feel proud or terrified. "I'm not exactly," she began. "Political," Stevens finished for her. "Good, they've got enough of those." He pushed the folder toward her. "You've earned this, Miller. Don't hide from it." That night, Sarah barely slept. The tent was quiet, but her mind was. She kept seeing faces, the soldiers she'd trained, the ones she'd treated, the ones who'd smiled in gratitude after walking away from injuries that might have been fatal months ago. Now she had to stand in front of officers and explain why it mattered. It should have been easy, but for someone who'd spent a year being ignored, the thought of being seen was strangely overwhelming. Still, she knew one thing: she couldn't let fear speak louder than purpose. So she began to prepare. She spent hours compiling data, training hours logged, skills mastered, lives saved or stabilized thanks to immediate care. She dug through reports and after-action summaries, collecting proof of what she'd witnessed every day. Then she went further, adding human stories. Private Chen and the heatstroke case. The patrol team who'd stabilized a teammate before medics arrived. The countless quiet victories that never made headlines but meant the world to those who lived them. Each name was a heartbeat in her presentation. The morning of the meeting came too soon. The regional headquarters stood miles away, a larger base with permanent buildings and wide, sun-bleached courtyards. It felt intimidating, industrial, too polished for someone who still missed the rough edges of her own camp. Sarah walked through the entrance carrying a small case of notes and a dry mouth. Her uniform was pressed, her boots shining, but her heart was thundering. She tried to remember what Jensen had told her before she left. "You don't need to impress them, just tell the truth. The truth's already impressive." Inside, the conference room was filled with officers, at least 20 of them, all ranks above hers. She recognized none of them. Major Stevens was there too, giving her an encouraging nod from across the table. At the center sat Brigadier General Martinez, a woman known for her calm authority. Her presence was quieter than Hawkins's, but no less commanding. When it was Sarah's turn, she rose. For a moment, her hands felt cold. Then she remembered the soldier whose breathing she'd stabilized in a desert tent, the pulse that had come back under her hands, the simple truth that she'd done it not for recognition, but because someone had to. Her voice found its rhythm. "Most soldiers think medical response is someone else's job," she began, "until the moment there's no one else." The room was silent. She walked them through the philosophy behind the program, how fear and inaction killed faster than any wound, and how training built confidence, not chaos. Then she showed them what that confidence looked like. Charts, photos, names, real results. She spoke of the patrol rescue, of soldiers performing first aid correctly before medics arrived, of reduced fatality projections, of the human difference that came from readiness. No dramatics, no exaggeration, just truth. And when she finished, she added softly, "I don't believe what we built is extraordinary. I believe it's necessary." For a long, breathless moment, the room stayed still. Then someone began to clap. It wasn't loud or ceremonial, it was human. Soon others joined. The sound echoed off the walls, warm and real. Sarah felt her throat tighten. When the applause faded, General Martinez stood. "Specialist Miller," she said, "what you've accomplished is remarkable. You've turned one moment of courage into a system that saves lives. That's leadership, whether you realize it or not." She paused, then continued. "The military has been discussing the establishment of a formal emergency response training school. We need people who can shape that program, people with real experience. Would you be interested in helping us build it?" Sarah's heart skipped. A school, a permanent program, training that could reach every base, every soldier. She tried to steady her voice. "Yes, ma'am, I would." Martinez smiled faintly. "Good, you'll be hearing from us soon." After the meeting, Sarah stepped outside into the sunlight. The air was dry and hot, but she barely felt it. The weight she'd carried for so long, the doubt, the invisibility, seemed to lift with each breath. She walked alone across the courtyard, her shadow long against the sand. She wasn't thinking of medals or titles. She was thinking of the first time she'd stepped into the medical tent without permission, her hands trembling as she fought to save a life. She'd broken rules that day, but maybe rules were meant to bend when lives were at stake. Maybe courage wasn't about defiance. Maybe it was about faith, the kind that whispers you're meant to be here, even when no one else believes it. The following weeks blurred into motion again. Plans were drawn, meetings held, proposals refined. Sarah became part of a small team designing the framework for the new Emergency Response Training School, a program that would eventually be implemented across multiple branches of the military. She worked alongside officers, educators, and senior medics, people with years of experience and higher ranks, all listening to her input like it mattered. Because now it did. She learned to navigate discussions about policy, curriculum, and structure. She spent nights drafting manuals, diagrams, and evaluation plans. But even amid all that structure, she never lost sight of what had started it all, a single decision to act. Whenever discussions became too technical or bureaucratic, she reminded them, "Don't forget who this is for. It's not for us. It's for the kid out there with shaking hands, trying to keep someone breathing until help arrives." And every time she said it, the room went quiet. Months passed, and construction began on the new facility. Sarah stood on the site one morning, watching crews assemble the frame of what would become the first military emergency response school. It was surreal, seeing something physical rise from what had once been just an idea scrawled in her notebook. Major Stevens joined her, his boots crunching on gravel. "You ever think it'd go this far?" She smiled faintly. "Honestly, no, I just wanted to be useful." He looked out at the growing structure. "You've done more than that, Miller. You've changed how we prepare to save our own." Sarah turned to him, sunlight catching the faint scar on his cheek. "It's not me, sir. It's every soldier who chose to learn instead of freeze." He nodded, smiling, spoken like someone who understands what leadership actually means. They stood there in silence for a while, watching the building take shape. And Sarah realized something. She'd found her place, not because the system had finally noticed her, but because she'd forced it to. Not through rebellion, but through purpose. That night, as the base quieted, she sat by her tent one last time before preparing to relocate to her new assignment. The desert sky stretched endlessly above her, cold and clear. She opened her notebook. the same one that had carried her doubts, her anger, her hope, and turned to the last filled page. She began to write slowly. It started with silence, with being unseen, with feeling like my hands didn't matter. But sometimes the world doesn't need you to wait for permission. It needs you to be ready when the moment arrives. She paused, her pen hovering over the paper. Then she wrote one final line. And when it comes, do the work quietly, completely, and without asking to be noticed. She closed the notebook gently, her reflection catching in the small metal clasp. Tomorrow she'd leave for the new training school, a new chapter, a new horizon. But for tonight, she sat beneath the desert stars, the same stars she'd once stared at, wondering if her purpose would ever find her. Now she knew. It wasn't about being chosen. It was about choosing to act when it mattered most. How do you teach something that can't be taught? That question followed Sarah Miller from the desert base to her new post, a facility that didn't yet have a name but already carried weight. The sign outside still read under construction. Yet inside, it was alive with purpose. The new emergency response training school sat on the edge of a mountain valley, surrounded by pines and wind-carved rock. It wasn't large or lavish, just a cluster of buildings, each built with function in mind. But to Sarah, it was something sacred, proof that action could become legacy. When she arrived, she expected to feel like a stranger. Instead, people greeted her with nods of familiarity. Some had heard the stories, others had read her reports. And for the first time, her name wasn't whispered in confusion. It was spoken with respect. But respect came with something else, expectation. She was no longer the field tent girl. Now she was the one everyone looked to. Her first few weeks were overwhelming. She oversaw the creation of training modules, from simulated battlefield scenarios to psychological conditioning exercises. Each plan she wrote had one purpose: to prepare soldiers not just to act, but to decide under pressure. Every morning she walked the training fields at dawn, clipboard in hand, wind tugging at her hair as recruits lined up for drills. They came from different units, different branches, different walks of life, all gathered under one belief: that saving a life was as honorable as taking a stand. Sarah moved among them quietly, correcting postures, adjusting techniques, offering advice that always ended with, "Remember, fear is normal. Freezing is optional." At night she sat in her small office, lights dim, reading through reports, successes, failures, progress. And sometimes she found herself staring out the window, watching the mountain stars and wondering how far this road would go and whether she was ready for where it led. 2 months into the program, General Martinez returned for an inspection. Sarah stood beside a line of trainees as the general walked the grounds. There was no fear this time, only pride. Martinez observed quietly as recruits demonstrated emergency response maneuvers, stabilizing fractures, clearing airways, coordinating evacuation calls under simulated stress. When the session ended, she turned to Sarah. "You've built something remarkable," the general said. "Your program's producing results faster than any projection we made." Sarah smiled faintly. "They're doing the hard part, ma'am." Martinez's eyes softened. Leadership isn't about doing the hardest work. It's about making others believe they can. Sarah hesitated, unsure how to respond. The general continued, her tone more personal now. "Do you realize what you've done? This school exists because of one choice, because, in a moment when you could have followed protocol, you followed your conscience instead. Never forget that." Then she added quietly, "Command's putting your name forward for a commendation. You'll be hearing soon." Sarah blinked. "A commendation?" Martinez nodded. "It's more than deserved." But Sarah wasn't sure how to feel. Pride, gratitude, unease. She'd never done any of this for medals. Recognition felt like standing under a spotlight she didn't ask for. That night she sat in her dorm, staring at the small brass nameplate on her desk. S. Miller, lead instructor. It still felt foreign. She reached for her notebook again, the same one that had traveled with her from the desert. She turned to a blank page and wrote, "Maybe the hardest part of success is accepting that others see more in you than you ever did in yourself." As weeks passed, the program grew. Each new class was larger than the last. Recruits came from across regions, some even from allied nations. The facility expanded, adding more equipment, simulation chambers, and even a field training arena designed to mimic real combat environments. Sarah watched it all evolve, part of her still in disbelief. Her staff grew too, including familiar faces. Jensen arrived one morning, a grin on his face and orders in hand. "Figured you could use someone who knows how to read your handwriting," he joked. She laughed, the kind of laugh that came from relief, not humor. "You sure you can handle another round of my checklists?" He shrugged. "I've been through worse." Having him there grounded her. It reminded her of where this all began, two friends in a dusty medical tent, patching wounds and hoping someone would notice the small good they were trying to do. But even in success, Sarah carried something quietly, a question she didn't voice aloud. Would she ever return to the field? She missed it, the immediacy, the raw urgency of saving lives in real time. The classroom walls felt safe, almost too safe. And sometimes, when she looked at the trainees running drills, she envied them. They were learning the lessons she'd paid for in fear and sweat. One evening, she stayed behind after hours, walking through the training yard under the floodlights. The air smelled of dust and pine resin. She stopped at one of the dummies, knelt, and adjusted the bandage on its arm, muscle memory guiding her hands. Her fingers lingered there. She whispered to the empty field, "I hope they'll be ready when it's real." Behind her a voice said softly, "They will be, because you were." She turned. It was Major Stevens, standing with his usual calm expression. "Sir," she said, straightening, "didn't hear you come in." He smiled faintly. "That's because I wasn't supposed to. I just wanted to see the place again before heading back out." "Back out?" He nodded. "Deployment. Training support for an operation overseas. They want me to oversee medical logistics." Sarah's chest tightened. "When?" "Tomorrow." She swallowed. "Then this isn't a goodbye visit, it's a check-in." He chuckled softly. "You always see right through people." They stood there in silence for a moment. Then Stevens said, "You know, Miller, not everyone in command would have approved of what you did back then, but I'm glad you didn't wait for approval." She looked down. "I just did what needed doing." "That's the point," he said. "You still do." The next day, the base gathered for a small ceremony before Stevens' departure. Sarah stood among her trainees as the general gave a brief address, nothing grand, just words of gratitude and duty. But then, to her surprise, Martinez called her name. Specialist Sarah Miller stepped forward. A hush fell over the courtyard. Sarah froze, then heart-pounding she stepped toward the podium. The general continued, her tone strong but warm. "For acts of initiative, courage, and exemplary service, resulting in the establishment of a new military medical training program, we recognize Specialist Sarah Miller with the Distinguished Service Commendation." The applause began slow, then rose like a wave. Jensen grinned. Stevens smiled from the crowd. Martinez pinned the medal to Sarah's uniform, then leaned close enough for only her to hear. "This isn't for the lives you saved," she whispered. "It's for reminding the rest of us why we serve." Sarah felt tears burn behind her eyes, not from pride but humility. When the ceremony ended, she stood silently, the medal heavy against her chest. Later, in the quiet of her dorm, she placed it on the desk beside her notebook. For a long time she just stared at it, the way the medal caught the light, the way it glimmered like frozen sunlight. It was beautiful, but it didn't define her. She opened her notebook instead. "I never wanted to be honored," she wrote. "I just wanted to help people stand a chance." Then, after a long pause, she added, "Maybe honor isn't something given. Maybe it's something you leave behind." Weeks turned into months. The training school thrived. Sarah continued to teach, refine, and mentor. She was no longer nervous in front of rooms full of officers. She was steady, confident, composed. Yet she remained the same at heart, the woman who preferred field tents to conference tables, silence to speeches. Whenever new trainees asked her why she joined the service, she never mentioned medals or recognition. She simply said, "To make sure the next person lives to see home." And that answer always landed heavier than any slogan could. One evening she received a message, a simple, handwritten letter sealed in a military envelope. It was from one of her first students. "Ma'am," it began, "I wanted you to know your training saved my teammate's life yesterday. I remembered your words. Fear is normal, freezing is optional. We didn't freeze, thank you." Sarah read it 3 times. She folded it neatly and placed it between the pages of her notebook, right next to her first entry, the one she'd written on that lonely desert night when she wasn't sure she belonged. Now the two moments existed side by side, beginning and continuation. That night, as the mountain wind swept through the trees, Sarah stepped outside. The stars glimmered faintly above the peaks, cold and endless. She took a slow breath, the air crisp and grounding. Everything felt still, as if time itself had paused to let her catch up. She thought of all she had learned, that leadership wasn't about being loud. It was about being there when silence needed a voice. That courage wasn't in the medals or commendations, but in the unseen choices that shaped lives. And most of all, that sometimes, the smallest act could ripple farther than anyone ever expected. She whispered softly into the wind, "I wasn't meant to be seen. I was meant to see what others didn't." Then, after a quiet pause, she added, "And that's enough." The wind carried her words into the dark, fading into the night. And as she turned back toward the glowing windows of the training hall, filled with voices, laughter, and life, she felt it again. That same, steady peace that had once kept her hands from trembling in a dusty field tent. The same truth that had followed her all this way. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. How far can one idea travel? That question lingered in Sarah Miller's mind as she stood at the flight line, watching a transport plane climb into the early morning sky. The insignia on its tail wasn't theirs. It belonged to an allied force half a world away. Inside that plane were crates of training manuals, medical kits, and simulation gear, all stamped with the seal of the new Emergency Response Training School. Her school. The work she'd once done in silence was now being exported to foreign bases, joint missions, even humanitarian deployments. Requests kept coming in, some official, some personal. People wanted to learn what she'd built. And with each shipment that left the runway, she felt the same mix of pride and disbelief. How had a forgotten supply specialist become someone whose notes could save lives continents away? She wasn't sure, but she knew this much. It started with one decision not to look away. Months turned into a year. The training program had spread across multiple commands, refined and standardized, but still carrying her fingerprints. Sarah remained at the mountain facility, now serving as its chief instructor and curriculum director. Her days were structured, classes, evaluations, simulations, but her nights were restless. Because despite all the success, a part of her longed for the field again. The real field. The smell of dust and adrenaline, the noise of helicopters, the heartbeat of risk. The place where knowledge was tested against time itself. She told herself she'd moved on, that teaching others was her mission now. But sometimes, when the wind rattled the windows, She could still hear the faint echo of that first desperate moment in the desert tent. The moment she stopped waiting for permission. One afternoon, she sat in her office when the intercom buzzed. Captain Miller, her new title still felt strange. She pressed the button, "Go ahead. Command wants you in the operations room. Priority meeting." Her pulse quickened, acknowledged. When she arrived, the room was filled with officers. Maps covered the walls, screens displayed live satellite feeds. At the center stood Brigadier General Martinez, and beside her, a familiar face, Major Stevens, newly promoted and freshly back from overseas. He gave her a nod that said more than words could. Martinez spoke first. "We have a developing situation overseas, a humanitarian mission turned unstable. Severe flooding has struck an Allied outpost near the coastal zone. Infrastructure's down, communication limited. Casualties are rising." Sarah's gaze shifted to the satellite map. Swirling clouds, submerged roads, faint SOS signals flickering on screen. Martinez continued. "Local forces requested emergency medical assistance, but logistics are chaos. We're sending a joint task team, half rescue, half medical. They specifically requested instructors from your program." Sarah's heart stilled. "My team." "Your team," Martinez confirmed. "We want you to lead the medical coordination on site." It wasn't a question. Sarah straightened. "When do we deploy?" "Tonight." Preparation moved fast. Within hours, gear was packed, manifests signed, and aircraft loaded. Jensen met her on the runway, helmet under his arm. "Back in the mud again, huh?" She smiled faintly. "Guess we both missed it." He grinned. "You know, some people celebrate their success by staying safe. You celebrate by running into chaos." Sarah adjusted her vest. "Chaos needs structure. That's why we're going." They climbed aboard the transport, the engines thundering to life. As the plane lifted off, the mountain base shrank beneath them, a beacon of what they'd built. For the first time in months, Sarah felt something inside her awaken, not restlessness, but readiness. The mission zone was nothing like the desert or the mountains. It was gray, wet, and drowned. The floodwaters had swallowed half the coastal plain. Temporary camps lined the high ground, filled with displaced civilians and exhausted soldiers. The air smelled of mud and fuel, and the sound of rotor blades never stopped. Sarah's boots sank into the soaked earth as she stepped off the helicopter. Rain streaked down her helmet. Around her, tents sagged under water weight, and medics rushed between patients wrapped in thermal blankets. She wasted no time. "Set up triage along the ridge," she ordered. "Move the severe hypothermia cases inside first. We'll build drainage trenches along the east slope." Her voice cut through the noise, steady, practiced, commanding. The trainees who'd followed her here snapped into motion, implementing every principle she'd once drilled into them back home. This wasn't a classroom anymore. This was the test. Hours blurred into exhaustion. They treated fractures, infections, hypothermia, even snake bites from displaced wildlife. Helicopters came and went in a steady rhythm, delivering supplies and evacuees. Sarah barely paused to eat. Every decision mattered. By the third night, she'd lost count of how many lives they'd stabilized. But one memory stayed clear. A young Allied medic, barely 20, froze mid-procedure when a patient went into shock. Sarah knelt beside her, gripping her trembling hands. "Look at me," she said. "What's the first rule?" The girl stammered, "D, don't freeze." "Right, now breathe. You know what to do, you trained for this." Together they worked, and within minutes, the patient's breathing steadied. The young medic exhaled shakily. "How did you stay calm?" Sarah smiled faintly. I just decided what mattered more." The words weren't rehearsed. They came from memory, the same lesson that had once kept her moving in that first emergency years ago. On the fifth day, a new problem hit. A landslide had collapsed part of a road leading to the main camp. Several vehicles were trapped below, including a medical truck carrying oxygen tanks. Sarah didn't hesitate. She and Jensen led a small team through the muck, navigating unstable terrain until they reached the wreck. The truck was tilted on its side, water rushing around its wheels. Inside, 2 soldiers were pinned. Sarah crawled through the shattered doorframe, her flashlight flickering. "Hold on," she called. "We've got you." The younger of the 2 groaned, trapped beneath a twisted seat frame. "Pressure's cutting circulation," she muttered, checking his pulse. "We need leverage." Jensen wedged a metal bar under the seat. "On 3. They pushed, the metal screeched, bending but not giving. Sarah gritted her teeth. Again. The frame shifted, just enough for her to pull the soldier free. Outside, medics rushed forward to carry him toward the stretcher. Sarah climbed out last, covered in mud, soaked to the bone but alive, every nerve humming with adrenaline and relief. The soldier looked at her weakly. "You're the one from the school." She nodded. He smiled faintly. "Then I guess your class worked." For the first time that day, she laughed, breathless, genuine and tired beyond measure. By the mission's end, hundreds of lives had been saved. The camp stabilized, the waters receded, and the world moved on as it always did. But for Sarah, something deeper had shifted. Seeing her trainees act with precision and calm reminded her that the work she'd done back home wasn't just theory. It was legacy in motion. The lessons had held. When they returned to base, the debrief was brief but heartfelt. General Martinez addressed the assembled teams. "You turned a disaster into an operation. The protocols developed by Captain Miller's school prevented countless fatalities. That's the measure of leadership, not speeches, but systems that keep people alive when everything falls apart." Applause filled the hangar. Sarah looked around at her team, Jensen, the young medic, the soldiers who had once been students. And for once she allowed herself to feel it fully, pride, unguarded and clean. That night she found a quiet spot overlooking the ocean. The storm had passed, the sky was clear again. The horizon glowed faintly with sunrise. She sat on a rock, boots still muddy, uniform still damp, notebook balanced on her knee. She wrote, "This time I didn't act alone. They carried it forward. Maybe that's what leadership really is, trusting others to keep the fire lit when your hands are too tired to hold it." She paused, then added beneath it, "And maybe courage isn't a moment. Maybe it's a chain, each link forged by someone who refused to stand still." She closed the notebook, the salt wind tugging at its pages. Behind her, Jensen approached quietly. "You writing your next speech?" She smiled, "Just trying to remember how we got here." He nodded toward the waves, "By not giving up." She laughed softly, "That's the short version." They stood there together, watching the dawn rise over a coast that had nearly drowned. For once the world felt balanced, raw but beautiful, broken yet rebuilding. And in that stillness, Sarah understood something she'd never put into words before. All the pain, the doubt, the invisible years, they weren't wasted. They were the groundwork, the silence before the sound, the waiting before the purpose. Everything she'd been through had built this. And somewhere far away, maybe another young recruit, unseen, unheard, was about to make the same choice she once did. To step forward. To act. To save someone no one else could. As the light crept higher, Jensen glanced at her. "You think you'll ever stop?" Sarah looked at him, the wind catching her hair. "No," she said softly, "because people never stop needing someone who doesn't freeze." He smiled. "Then I guess the world's in good hands." She looked back toward the horizon, endless, open, filled with possibilities. The mission was over, but her work was. It never would be. Because for Sarah Miller, purpose wasn't a destination. It was motion, quiet, relentless and human. What do you do when the mission ends? That question lingered long after the planes stopped flying, after the uniforms were folded, after the field tents came down one last time. Sarah Miller stood at the edge of the runway, watching the last helicopter lift off into a pale blue sky. The noise faded into the distance, swallowed by wind and silence. She'd spent years surrounded by motion, commands, noise, emergencies, purpose. And now, for the first time, everything was still. She should have felt relief, but instead she felt suspended. Because for people like her, endings never came clean. They came in quiet echoes, the hum of a med kit being zipped shut, the ghost of radio chatter fading into memory, the faint smell of antiseptic and dust that never truly left your hands. She closed her eyes and listened to the stillness. No sirens, no shouting, no calls for help. Just the sound of wind moving through the empty airfield. And for the first time, she realized she didn't know what came next. Months passed slowly after the coastal operation. The emergency training school continued to grow, but Sarah had stepped back not out of fatigue but reflection. Others now led the courses she'd built. The system worked without her constant oversight, which meant she'd done her job. Her name remained on the walls, on the manuals, on the programs being taught across bases, but she no longer chased the front lines of it. Instead, she began to travel. She visited the same outposts that once ignored her. She shook hands with recruits who didn't know her story, and she smiled quietly as they practiced drills she designed. It was humbling and strangely healing. Because she realized something. Legacy didn't need recognition to be alive. It just needed to keep working. One evening, she found herself back in the desert, the place where it had all begun. The camp had changed. New tents, new faces, new command. But the air felt the same, dry, endless, full of memory. She walked through the base slowly, the orange sun setting behind the dunes. Every step carried ghosts. The night she disobeyed orders to help the wounded, the moment General Hawkins had looked her in the eye and said, "You saved this unit." It felt like a lifetime ago. Maybe it was. The medical tent still stood in roughly the same spot. Inside, a younger medic looked up, startled to see her. "Ma'am." Sarah smiled, just passing through. The medic blinked. "You're Captain Miller, right? The one who?" Sarah held up a hand gently, "Just Sarah." He nodded, smiling nervously. "Well, if you're looking for the supply records, we still use your templates. Made things easier for everyone." She chuckled softly, glad to hear that. She stepped back outside, the evening light spilling gold across the sand. It was strange to return to a place that had once defined her and realize it no longer did. She had outgrown the tent, but she still carried it inside her. Later that night, she sat on a crate by the perimeter fence, her old notebook open in her lap. Its pages were worn, the edges frayed. Every line told a story, not of glory or triumph, but of humanity, of decisions made when no one was watching. She turned to one of the earliest entries. "They don't see me, but I see what needs doing." She smiled faintly, tracing the faded ink with her thumb. Then she flipped to the newest page and began to write again. Maybe that's the point. Maybe service isn't about being seen. Maybe it's about keeping the world moving quietly, one heartbeat at a time. She paused, listening to the low hum of the generators in the distance. And maybe purpose doesn't end when the work does. Maybe it changes shape, waiting to be passed to someone else. Her hand trembled slightly as she finished the sentence. Not from fatigue, but emotion, the kind that catches you when you realize how far you've come from the person you once were. The next morning, she prepared to leave the base. As she walked toward the transport vehicle, a familiar voice called out from behind her. "Captain Miller." She turned. It was Private Chen, now wearing a sergeant's insignia, the same soldier who'd saved a teammate during the heatstroke incident years ago. Chen saluted sharply, grinning. Didn't think I'd see you here again. Sarah smiled. Didn't think I'd see anyone I trained still calling me ma'am. Chen laughed. Old habits. She hesitated, then added quietly, you should know one of my soldiers used your field manual last month. Saved a civilian convoy during an accident. I thought you'd want to hear that. Sarah's chest tightened. Thank you, she said softly. Chen shrugged. You built the blueprint, we just follow it. Sarah looked at her for a long moment, pride and humility blending into something wordless. Take care of them, she said finally. I will, ma'am. They saluted, not out of duty but gratitude. Then Sarah climbed into the transport and watched the base fade into the horizon once more. Back home, civilian life felt distant. She tried to settle the small apartment, quiet mornings, long walks through empty parks. She even started volunteering at a community medical center, helping veterans adjust to civilian healthcare systems. But even there, she couldn't help but organize things, restructuring protocols, teaching nurses field-efficient methods, quietly turning chaos into order. Her colleagues called her the calm one. They didn't know the story, they didn't need to. Because Sarah wasn't living for stories anymore, she was living for peace. And sometimes she found it in small gestures, in patient smiles, in moments when everything was still and the world didn't need saving. One afternoon, as she was leaving the clinic, she noticed a young woman sitting on the steps, uniform wrinkled, eyes red. Sarah hesitated, then walked over. Rough day. The woman nodded. Just got discharged, medical leave. I don't know what to do next. Sarah sat beside her, quiet for a moment. Do you want the truth? She asked gently. The woman looked up. Yes. It never really gets easier, Sarah said softly. You'll keep asking yourself who you are when the mission ends, but one day you'll realize you were never just your rank or your station. You were the choices you made when no one was watching. That's the part that lasts. The woman blinked back tears. Were you in? Sarah smiled faintly. Once, a long time ago. Did you ever feel lost? Every day, Sarah said, until I stopped trying to find a title and started being useful again. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that heals more than words. When the woman finally stood to leave, she turned back and said, Thanks. You sound like someone who saved a lot of people. Sarah smiled, small, tired, honest. Just a few, she said, but they were enough. That night she walked home through the quiet streets. The sun had dipped below the skyline, painting everything in dusky gold. She reached her apartment and placed her old notebook on the windowsill, open to the final page. She added one last entry, a line that had lived in her mind for years, but had never found the courage to be written. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. She set down the pen, exhaled slowly, and watched the city lights flicker in the distance. Then, without planning to, she whispered aloud, her voice soft, steady, full of peace. Maybe that's all we were ever meant to do. She closed the notebook gently. Months later, long after she'd faded quietly from the military's daily reports, a letter arrived at her doorstep. It was stamped with a familiar seal, the insignia of the Emergency Response School. Inside was a single page. Captain Miller, it read. We wanted you to know that your program has now been adopted across all Allied divisions. Over 12,000 soldiers trained, 3,000 lives directly saved. Your name is etched on the cornerstone of the new central facility. We thought you'd like to know that your work still lives on, and so does your spirit. At the bottom, beneath the typed signature, was a handwritten note. You taught us that silence is strength. We never forgot. Sarah sat there for a long time, reading and rereading the words. Then she looked out the window again at the same sky, the same wind moving through the trees. And she smiled. Because somewhere, in some faraway field tent or storm-swept base, Someone was still doing the work she once started. Someone was choosing to act instead of wait. And that meant the mission never really ended. She stood, the evening light glowing against her face, and whispered quietly, almost to herself. "We pass the torch, that's how it's always been." The city hummed below, alive, unaware, but that didn't matter. The world didn't need to know her name to feel her impact. Because true legacy didn't echo in applause. It lived quietly in the hands of those who carried it forward. Sarah Miller, once the forgotten girl in a field tent, had become the foundation of a system that would outlast her lifetime. And that was enough. She turned away from the window, her shadow blending with the soft light, her voice a whisper that seemed to fade into something larger, something timeless. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.